Okay, this time I'm working on MPDInfoScreen2. I'm going to work on 3 features that I'll talk about as I'll work on them. First thing I'm working on is making the password prompt implicit. That is, by default, it will use a prompt if the password is needed. I'm adding a print line here to say that the pprompt option is deprecated, because by default, it's as if it's used. After making that option a no-op in Args, I set up some stuff in main and client. So instead of checking for the flag that's usually true if pprompt is specified, it just assumes that pprompt is specified. Which means changing the if check to just an else in this case. There might be a few other places where I need to make changes like this. Here I'm setting up a build so that I can test it. Again, since asciinema is something that only records to terminal, the application is not visible, but you can kind of tell what's going on from the output. This is another place where I get rid of a check on the flag that's no longer applicable because it's by default true now. And here's another spot where I removed the test on that flag. So it works properly, and thus making a git commit for it. The next thing I'm going to fix or work on is based on a previous change where I fixed the loading of album art binary data. The change I'm adding is to make it a sleep for 1 millisecond every time it needs to read again. Because if the loading of the binary data has to wait on a read call on a socket, it might do a busy wait because it continues directly into the read call on the socket. So instead of busy waiting, I add a 1 millisecond sleep. Before I do this, I add a debug print to check how often this is going to get called. It does happen at least a few times. I think that's reason enough to add a 1 millisecond sleep. In the grand scheme of things, losing 1 millisecond isn't that bad, considering the album art still loads pretty fast due to setting the binary size close to a megabyte per fetch, according to the MPD protocol. This project does have Clang format configured, so every time I build, it runs Clang format on all the sources. Testing. Just some testing to see that the album art loads promptly. So that's just the git commit for the 1 millisecond sleep. Okay, the third thing I'm implementing is a prompt for the host address or the host socket. This feature would make it possible to run MPDInfoScreen2 without any arguments, which can be helpful if you're running mostly GUI apps and stuff like that. You would instead turn on the program, start the program that is, and it will prompt on the window what information it needs, which is the host address or host socket path, and then the password when it needs it, if it needs it. MPD can be configured to not need a password, or have read level privileges that doesn't require a password. Because I need the window to be ready earlier, I moved the initialization of the window. This if statement checks if either address or socket path was specified. And if it hasn't been, the branching call goes into the inside part of the if statement. If statements are known as branch statements because in assembler, an if statement makes the program execution line by line go to two different places. In other words, it branches off like a fork in the road. It does this via goto in assembler. Well, it can be a simple goto call. It can be a goto if register is 0 or something like that. x86 is pretty complicated with its instruction set. ARM, I would suppose it would be a lot less complicated with ARM, but even on ARM, I would still call it a branching statement. An if statement is a branching statement, basically. I'm adding setters to the args because I can't. The existing code depends on what's set in the args struct. So I need to add setters to add the host address or the host socket path when it's prompted from the user through the GUI. So I changed the if to a while. A while, I guess it's kind of similar to a branch, but it's mainly a loop where the goto goes to back to an earlier section of code such that it would go to the goto again eventually, unless a condition is met. And here I decided to make a class instead of just making a function with state in it. I figure it would be easier and cleaner to use a dedicated class for parsing, well, not parsing, requesting data from the user through the GUI. The selection variable is basically tells it's used to see if the address is being set or the socket path is being set. Since there's only two things being set, selection will be either 0 or 1. And this initialization is very important in C++. Without the initializer's member initialization, selection could have been set to a random variable if it hadn't been initialized to 0. Here I'm putting in CMake the new class files. I forget to add the same thing to the bundled CMake list file, but I do that in a later version that I push to MPDInfoScreen2. A const expression is like compile time known values. In C++, usually this was done via templates, but constant expressions, which were added in a newer version of C++, like C++ 13 maybe, I don't remember exactly. There are other things to do things in compile time other than templates now. So I need a way to know how long the printed texts are. And Raylib provides the function measured text to get the width if it's drawn with just a size parameter. I accidentally leave the draw text to the address string on the second part. I fixed that later in the session, but something to note. And here are some getters. I should have kept the if statement here. I'll leave it open as to why, I should have left an if statement. Just something to think about. Ternary expression. Expression, question mark, part 1 if it's true, colon, part 2 if it's false. If I had kept that modulus 2, selection would have wrapped around when key down is pressed. So I set this up so that I can handle Unicode input, which is tricky. One thing I learned about Unicode is anything that's Unicode, the most significant bit in every byte in Unicode is set, I believe. Which means that there are no null characters in Unicode UTF-8, which is good to know. It's a very interesting syntax. You should look it up on Wikipedia how they implemented UTF-8. It's very interesting. There should be articles on it as well. Okay, I just at the time of this recording, I see a bug that I didn't fix. I will fix this after. Yeah, there is a bug here. It's not that hard to find, but by the end of this implementation, there exists a bug that I just noticed while recording this voiceover. So, I'll leave it an exercise to the reader or watcher if you want to figure that out. just this part of the code handling the input for the character that may be Unicode. I had a print line here just in case I need to debug stuff, because I wasn't completely certain that this first draft, or at least this first version of this character handling code would work properly. It's just the nature of things with making brand new code for something. Sometimes you overlook something, sometimes there's something you forgot, and you need to keep testing it to make sure that it has the behavior you want it to have. Now I use the HostPrompt class in main. If I don't set the target FPS with Raylib, it will default to not using a sleep function to maintain the frame rate. So in other words, it will never sleep if you never set the target FPS, which is like using 100% of one processor core on the update draw loop. So if you're using Raylib and your computer's fan starts running like crazy, you probably forgot to set the target FPS to something like 60 or 30. Here I fixed the drawing of the address twice. Now it draws the address once and then the socket path once. For some reason I tried to input Unicode, but I couldn't get FCTX or whatever it's called to work properly with it. I'll probably test it again later, but for now I assume, other than that bug I noticed, it should work. At this point, I think I got a functionality working for the most part. Here I add a string a string variable in main. It's kind of messy the way I did this. Basically, I wanted to have some notification of when I wanted to have some kind of GUI notification when a connection fails or there's some connection problem. So instead of just only having it in the terminal output, standard error output, I also wanted to display some message on the window that's being drawn, which is the purpose of the message variable. Naturally, it's wrapped in an optional, so that if it's none or whatever, if it's not holding a valid string, it doesn't draw, which is the perfect use case. Except for the fact that the string could just be an empty string, and that could be the check not to draw it, now that I think about it. But the intent is more clear if you use an optional. The optional also has a cast to a boolean, so you could put the optional value in the if statement by itself, and it will return true if the optional is holding something. I give it an offset of 20 pixels from the top of the screen, because within MPT display there's also some output that shows up at the top of the screen, like prompting for the password. But ideally, those two different things shouldn't be displayed at the same time. They shouldn't, thinking about it. One way to clear an optional is to equal std : null opt, which is created just for optionals. Another way is to call the reset function on an optional. Kind of got confused trying to get the message to clear. If you noticed carefully, I didn't recompile after making my changes to the code. I do eventually get a good implementation, but this little test here, I forgot to compile. which is kind of painful to see, but it happens. In C, error numbers are lookupable. If you have error numbers from a program output, like a specific one, there should be an error command on Linux, ERRNO. Just type that in the error number and it'll tell you the descriptive name of the error. At this point, the main functionality has been implemented. There are like maybe 2 bugs that I realized while rewatching my programming session, but well, bugs happen. No one's perfect. Um, depending on your beliefs, that is. Anyways, that's basically it. So thanks for watching.